Welcome, everybody. My name is Larry Rosenthal. I am the chair of the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies, and I'm very pleased with the event we're going to have today, and I appreciate all of you being here and the people online as well. So this event is sponsored not only by the Center for Right-Wing Studies, but as well by the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion. Today's talk is on the radical mind, the origins of right-wing Catholic and Protestant coalition building, which I think is going to be an extremely interesting topic. As many of you know, we chose to reschedule this event to honor a strike by university employees. So I thank you all for your patience with the rescheduling, and as I suggested to Professor Ebin, that there is a silver lining in as much as, thanks to Pope Leo, the discussion of the Catholic right has been more apparent and public than it normally is. Okay, people in the room, please silence your phones and other devices that may be noisy. And for those on Zoom, you can use the Q&A feature to ask questions. Professor Ebin will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we will have questions both from the live audience and from Zoom. And with that, it's a real pleasure to introduce Chelsea Ebin, who is Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Drew University. She is co-editor of the book Male Supremacism in the United States, From Patriarchal Traditionalism to Misogynist Incels and the Alt-Right, and a co-founder of the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism. She's also a fellow of the Far Right Analysis Network. She's the author of numerous academic articles and is an active public scholar. Today, she's going to talk with us about her new book, which is The Radical Mind, Origins of Right-Wing Catholic and Protestant Coalition Building. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ebin.
Start a timer. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for having me here. I'm originally from Santa Cruz, and as a working class kid, getting to speak at Berkeley feels like really quite a special thing. So I'm very, very pleased to be here, and excited to talk to you about the book. So I'll just get right to it. To provide a little bit of context, Larry gave a very nice introduction to some of the other things I do, but all of my work tries to understand the relationship between supremacist ideologies, the creation of right-wing movements, and then the threats that these pose to individuals and institutions, right? So trying to connect the dots across those things to look at how ideas and institutions in American politics are shaped by the right and how the right seeks to shape those institutions in turn. Now, the supremacist ideologies that I focus on, first and foremost, is Christian supremacy, but co-constitutive of Christian supremacy is also white supremacy, male supremacy, and anti-Semitism. Now, we hear a lot recently about Christian nationalism, which Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry define as an ideology that idealizes and advocates the fusion of American civic life with a particular type of Christian identity and culture. And Philip Gorski, who also writes on Christian nationalism, helpfully reminds us that in America, religious nationalism has always been entangled with white supremacism. It has always been white Christian nationalism. I use the term Christian supremacy instead because, as sort of in line with Matthew Taylor's work, I agree that Christian supremacy is much more organized and ideological than Christian nationalism, and it's more comprehensive in scope too. Christian supremacists aren't just venting their feelings about the United States needing to be more Christian. They have a plan and a program, and they have a global vision that transcends parochial US concerns. So what I'm going to talk about today and the coalition that forms between Protestants and Catholics really is a coalition that aims at Christian supremacism, not just Christian nationalism, right? It's a more proactive, more forward-looking, and really more comprehensive plan. Now, I started the research for this as a graduate student, and at the time, Obama had just been elected, and there were headlines like the one up top that says The Evangelical Crack Up by David Kirkpatrick in 2007. And then in 2012, election 2012 marks the end of evangelical dominance in politics. And when I went to graduate school, I knew that I wanted to research the Christian right, but I wasn't quite sure what the specific focus would be. And there were pretty strong headwinds where folks who were advising me said, no one's going to care. You certainly won't get a job writing about the Christian right. And so I was trying to find, something that I could really sink my teeth into. And Sarah Palin came to my rescue. So Sarah Palin had been on Fox News, and she was talking about natural law and natural rights. And my partner sent me the clip and said, can you explain to me why she's using rhetoric we would associate with Catholicism? And I was like, oh, maybe I can explain this. I can certainly go looking for an answer. And what I found was that Sarah Palin's lead speechwriter was a conservative Catholic. And this was surprising to me because Sarah Palin is from the Pentecostal faith. She's a non-denominational evangelical. And my understanding was that American Catholics and Protestants didn't have a very cozy relationship, right? Historically, there's been a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States. In the 19th century, Tisa Winger explains it as Protestant triumphalists, increasingly portrayed Catholics as inherently different from and clearly inferior to the superior race, right? And here you have a picture of the anti-Catholic Native American, they called themselves Native Americans, provoking a series of riots in Philadelphia in the mid-19th century. And so there's this long history of opposition and antipathy. A lot of anti-immigrant attitudes got wrapped up in anti-Catholicism. And so I was trying to understand if in the 1960s, when JFK, in 1960, when JFK ran for president, there had been deep vitriol directed at him as a Catholic. These are images, they're grainy because they're poor archival scans that I did. But one says Protestants in a spiritual stupor, breed strong Roman Catholicism, and the other says the Pope for president, right? When JFK was running for president, the argument from many conservative Protestants was that a vote for him would be a vote for the Pope, and the Pope would govern from the Vatican. So I wanted to understand how we get from here to a place where 30 years later, First Things, which is a ecumenical religious journal that was founded by Richard Newhouse, who had been a Protestant and converted to Catholicism, published in 1994 what probably to us now doesn't seem like a shock heard around the world, but at the time was. It was a statement called Evangelicals and Catholics Together, the Christian Mission in the Third Millennium. And this document said that it attends to the specific problems and opportunities in the relationship between Roman Catholics and evangelical Protestants, and affirms as Christ is one, so the Christian mission is one. Right, so starting with Sarah Palin and her use of Catholic seeming discourse, I launched down this rabbit hole of trying to understand where the transformation had occurred between 1960, when JFK was lambasted for being a Catholic, and 1994, when the Evangelicals and Catholics Together statement was published, right? So trying to understand what it was And then we could even fast forward a little bit to the present to try and understand how we end up here, right? And here we have the image that most folks might have seen of that Trump put out on his Truth Social website, an AI-generated image of him as the Pope. And certainly Lindsey Graham added fuel to this, tweeting that he thought Trump should be chosen as the next Pope. And on the other side, J.D. Vance, who is a Catholic convert, at a conference sponsored by the New Apostolic, by the sort of leader of the New Apostolic Reformation wall now. And so, right, like what's happened in order to foster this cozy relationship and to create a culture where the president can, I guess he was joking, I'm not sure. He may actually have wanted to become the Pope. It's anybody's guess. So I don't want to speak for him, but certainly that image speaks volumes. All right, so this leads to the project of the Radical Mind, which is to explore the puzzle of Catholic and Protestant political and sociocultural convergence and collective mobilization in this period. And I narrowed it down, right? It sort of goes, I say it goes from 1965 to 1985. It's actually a little earlier in the 1960s that it begins, and maybe gestures beyond 1985. But it's roughly a 20-year period that I was looking at and trying to understand how the new Christian right forms as a result, or with this coalition as a core part of it. And if you think I'm exaggerating about the significance of bringing these two groups together, I have here a quote from Paul Weyrich, who I'll talk about quite a bit, that is the epigraph to the book. And he said, Falwell, referring to the Reverend Jerry Falwell, the founder of the Moral Majority, I said, Falwell, looking toward the press table, said it all. The media had better understand that in another context we would be shedding blood. But our commitment to the family has brought those of us of differing religious views and backgrounds together to fight a just cause, to fight for the family. Right? And really, Weyrich was talking about bringing Catholics and Protestants together because he took all the credit for doing that. And I give him most of the credit, but he doesn't get all of it. Key questions that the book seeks to answer are how these two groups converge and what motivated the formation of the coalition. I spend quite a bit of time in the book looking at how they broker it, right? What the strategies of the coalition are, and then what the implications of the coalition are for how we think about the new right, how we understand the Christian right, and what its long-term goals are. To try and answer those questions, spent a lot of time in a lot of different archives, including here at Berkeley at Bancroft Library in the Sarah Diamond collection, but most extensively with the Paul Weyrich scrapbooks at the Library of Congress. And these are wild. And I say wild in the sense that it is just so exciting to get your hands on a collection like that. And I was very fortunate that I was one of the first people to have access after the collection had been cataloged. So some of the book is just the fortuitous timing that led me to these documents. But Paul Weyrich scrapbooked every reference to himself in seemingly every media source available. And either he or one of his aides very helpfully underlined his name in every article. So very, very, very useful. I spent a lot of time there. I also spent quite a lot of time at the American Heritage Center at the University of Wyoming. And I want to just flag that because the thing with the Paul Weyrich scrapbooks, right, is they were curated by him. And so they present the story he wanted to tell about his own life. And so I really felt that it was important to get other perspectives from the archives on these actors and on their significance. So the new right papers that are more institutional are at the American Heritage Center. I also spent some time at Liberty University, where the archives have been curated so extensively as to be not very helpful at all. And at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library, which I would say is just like a grand place to go. It really reflects Carter's sweet spirit. You're like, there's a pond and some ducks, and it's really pleasant. And here are images just from the archive so you can get a sense of what it looked like. There's the Roman octopus, going back to that comment about JFK, right? That was part of the anti John F. Kennedy Jr. campaign. Some new right documents. Here's a little Reagan in the middle. And then a lot of handwritten letters that took some effort to work my way through, but were very, very helpful. All right, I've already mentioned most of the key groups that we're going to talk about, but if you read the book, it's annoying, and I apologize that there are, right, we're talking about the Catholic New Right, which I abbreviate as CNR, and then the New Christian Right, which is NCR, and it can get a little confusing, but I couldn't really figure out a way around that, right? These are just the names of the groups. So I'm looking at conservative Catholics and conservative Protestants, and those map onto the conservative Catholics, onto the New Right, conservative Protestants, onto what we tend to think of as the Christian Right. And then in their union, they form the New Christian Right. So key findings, I'm going to talk through kind of 3 of the key findings of the book. And the first one is that the New Right was deeply, deeply Catholic. So the New Right is this insurgent movement that appears in the early 1970s, in part in response to the perception that Richard Nixon is not conservative enough. And New Right activists want to find a way of pushing conservatism, not just in the Republican Party, but also in the Democratic Party, right? They're sort of open to trying to support and draw in conservative Democrats as well. And there's much that we could say about realignment and sort of electoral changes that make this impossible. But at the time, it really, right, they were kind of trying to provide support for conservatives across the political spectrum. Now, most of the writing on the New Right presents them as secular, right? It says that they were motivated by conservative politics, and their conservative politics were innovative because they were much more willing to jettison the principles that we tend to associate with the old right in order to attract voters, right? So they did a lot of things that at the time seemed to flirt with populism, where they would talk about, you know, providing monetary support to workers or supporting unions. And these were things that people were quite shocked by, and led to charges that the New Right was not conservative, it was radical. They proudly claimed that they were radical and proudly claimed that they were bucking the old trends, but they were not proudly Catholic. The Catholicism was really behind the scenes and could be found in the leadership of the New Right. So the 2 primary architects we tend to associate with the New Right are Richard Viguerie and Paul Weyrich. Both of them were devout Catholics. And other actors like Connie Marshner, who I will talk a little bit about, were really very, very, very much informed by their Catholic worldview. So Paul Weyrich might be familiar to people because he very famously said that he didn't want everyone to vote, because if everyone votes, the Republican Party fares less successfully, which is the quote that gets trotted out the most, but also because he was one of the founders of the Heritage Foundation, which has gotten a lot of attention recently because of Project 2025. Connie Marshner gets much less attention, but she took credit for successfully getting President Nixon to veto universal child care not once, but twice. So if you have at any point written a very large check for daycare, you can thank Connie Marshner for that. She was very proud of doing this and saw it as really a necessary step in ensuring the implementation of her conservative Catholic worldview through social policy. So a lot of what I found most interesting about these Catholics was why at this time, right? If we have this long history of anti-Catholicism, 1960, we have, you know, a lot of anger being directed at Catholics. What happens to make it possible for conservative Catholics to form this coalition and to really enter into the mainstream of American politics? And what I find, right, is that the 1960s are not only a time of great social transformation in the broader culture with this, you know, anti-war movement, free speech movement, sexual revolution, civil rights movements, but also, right, a time of transformation within the Catholic Church. And Vatican II creates a space for conservative Catholics to begin to identify as conservative, right, to become sort of what we might call hyphenated Catholics. And it also creates ecumenical reforms that allow for conservative Catholics to look outside the Catholic Church to form coalitions with other groups. Much of what invigorates them is opposition to the liberalizing reforms of the Second Vatican Council, but then those liberalizing reforms are what make it possible for them to produce the kind of political coalitions that lead to our current moment. The specific issues that they were most concerned about, beyond those that were specific to the Catholic Church, were population control, right? In 1965, the Supreme Court decided Griswold versus Connecticut, legalizing access to oral contraception for married women. Several years later in Eisenstadt, they extended access to unmarried women as well. And in the 1960s, there was a lot of sort of Malthusian rhetoric, right, about a coming population crisis, that we needed to get the world's population under control. Should be noted, right, that of course this was very much tinged with eugenics and racist rhetoric around who were and were not desirable members of the world's population. But the idea of birth control being something that could be forcibly administered was very much at the forefront of conservative Catholics' minds in the early 1960s. And opposition to the civil rights movement also became a catalyst for actors like Paul Weyrich, who in particular were upset and perturbed by the joining forces of Catholics and Protestants in support of the civil rights movement. Now, while this sort of transformation taking place in the 1960s really helps to create a space for conservative Catholics to come into their own politically, they have a problem where they cannot mobilize the Catholic vote, right? There is no singular Catholic vote. With Kennedy, the Democratic Party seemingly had a lock on Catholics, and you cannot reliably turn out a singular Catholic vote on behalf of either party, right? Now it's about 50-50. White Catholics split just a little bit heavier for the Republican Party. Catholics of color split a little bit heavier for the Democratic Party, but you still don't have a reliable base that can be mobilized in its entirety. And so for Paul Weyrich, this becomes very, very important because he wants to mobilize people on behalf of conservatives, and he needs to find a base that he can do so with. All right. Second big finding is that the Catholic New Right and evangelical and fundamentalist Protestants built their coalition by capitalizing on these changes within their respective religious traditions and communities. So on the, maybe I'll hold off a second on that. And then by developing new coalition building strategies and stitching together a plurality of right-wing single issue groups under the umbrella of the family. Pro-family politics becomes the way in which these groups are stitched together. But a little side note, just because of some terminology. In the book, I use the methodology of discursive institutionalism I'm a political scientist and we love jargon. That is just something political scientists get really excited about. So within discursive institutionalism, we talk about coordinative and communicative discourses. Now, the communicative discourses are exactly what it sounds like, right? The way in which a set of ideas is communicated more broadly and transmitted to a population outside of that is creating it. The coordinative discourse is really the nuts and bolts, right? How do you create the policies? How do you build the institutions? So jargon for jargon's sake. But they're helpful terms for understanding how this coalition gets, or helpful frameworks for understanding how this coalition gets brokered. So on the Catholic New Right side, right, the coordinative discourses are really an alphabet soup worth of think tanks and institutions. The central organizations of the New Right that developed in 3 years between 1973 and 1976 included, but were not limited to, the Committee for Survival of Free Congress, the National Conservative Political Action Committee, Conservative Caucus, Conservative Victory Fund, Committee for the Republican Study Committee, the Senate Steering Committee, the Committee for Responsible Youth Politics, the Richard A. Viguerie Company, the Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms, the American Conservative Union, and last but not least, Heritage. Right, the Heritage Foundation. These were facilitated by the emergence of direct mail as a fundraising tool, right? So there's a lot of really interesting stuff that happens on the technological side that allows them to build these institutions and then to fund them. Also some problems with incestuous fundraising lists that lead to people getting quite irked by multiple requests for donations from that alphabet soup of different organizations that are all sending letters to the same people. And then the organizational strategy really emphasizes single issue politics. And so by single issue politics, right, I mean abortion or gun rights, right? One issue that becomes the sort of focal point around which mobilization happens. And ad hoc coalitions, bringing together these different single issues in a really flexible, malleable way. The reason this is so important is because in political science, we often argue that coalitions have moderating effects, right? Once you bring people into coalition, they're going to moderate their viewpoints in order to work with one another. What's so striking about the Catholic New Right is that they forge coalitions that, rather than moderate, really escalate or sort of invigorate the most right-leaning positions. And I argue that they do this by focusing on single issues and sort of resisting forming broad-based coalitions too early in the game. Eventually they do under the umbrella of pro-family politics. This picture does not blow up well, I apologize, but it's a hand-drawn diagram that I found in the archives. It's not there's no authorship designated, but it's from 1975. And in the very center of this web is Paul Weyrich, right? It says Weyrich. And then around are these laundry list of acronyms for different organizations and think tanks. And that those lines show how Weyrich is connected to each and every one of them. And his centrality as a political broker. On the conservative Protestant side, we also have new institutions being built, right? There are media empires like Jerry Falwell's, and the sort of technological contributions are also very significant, right? Access to satellites allows televangelists to beam their messages into people's homes as they are sort of utilizing direct mail fundraising and televangelist telethons. Does anyone remember these from, yeah, right? You would like late at night stumble across the show and they'd be like, call now, pledge your money. So that influx of money allowed for new church plants and educational institutions, which mirrors pretty closely some of the institution building that was happening on the New Right side, right? Organizations were being established and built. They were being funded in many similar ways. one of the most, I would say, emotionally troubling things I came across in the archives was a letter from a woman who had been receiving direct mail fundraising letters from Jerry Falwell. And because her name was written in what looked like handwriting, she thought that the letters were actually from him. And she was expressing her disappointment and hurt that she had been giving her money when he hadn't actually been reaching out to her. But I raised that to say that, right, these technologies were very, very new and people were experiencing them for the first time, right? So lots of social transformation, economic transformation as a result of that. The other thing that's happening on the conservative Protestant side is decentralized local level organizations, oftentimes focused around opposing sex education in public school curricula or other types of public school curriculum were sort of touted as being secular humanist, which has become, right, was at the time, did the same work that now critical race theory or woke does in the broader imaginary, right? Everything that people opposed was called secular humanist. Now we call it CRT. Neither of those terms actually mean what people thought they did. They just get deployed in very specific and effective ways. And so lots of local level organizations, but also the development of this idea of co-belligerency. So there's a lot to be said about the way in which fundamentalist Protestants sort of relate to the outside world. But the stereotype is that fundamentalists withdraw from society, right? Turn inwards, particularly after the Scopes trial. This isn't actually true. It's much more complicated than that. But fundamentalist Protestants have often expressed hostility to working with non-fundamentalists, right? Even evangelical Protestants, but especially Catholics. And so how do you get over that, right? How do you get past this antipathy? Francis Schaeffer, who we will return to in a second, devised a strategy of co-belligerent. Oh, here's one of these fundraising letters. Sorry, I didn't get to it. I just want to highlight for you a couple of sentences in it. It is a letter that is in sort of soliciting funds to support Prop 6, which is also known as the Briggs Initiative, which was an initiative introduced in 1978 in California that, if passed, teachers who were found to have taken part in, quote, public homosexual activity or public homosexual conduct would be fired. And public homosexual conduct was defined as the advocating, soliciting, imposing, encouraging, or promoting of private or public homosexual activity directed at or likely to come to the attention of school children and or other employees. Just want to highlight this because it failed. The Briggs Initiative did not pass, but not for lack of trying. So Jerry Falwell in this letter says, if America is saved, it will be people like you who are responsible under God for her deliverance. I personally want to thank you for your financial and prayerful support. Nothing is too hard for the Lord. In the years that lie ahead, I believe that we will be in a constant battle for our lives. Skipping ahead a little, we've already advanced this money to the campaign in California. It is already spent. We took money from the general operating fund of the Old Time Gospel Hour in Lynchburg, Virginia, in order to finance the battle against immorality in California. We were glad to make this sacrifice. However, we desperately need to collect your pledge and all other pledges in the Southern California area immediately. Right, so you can really imagine someone receiving this with like a handwritten name and a handwritten signature and thinking, like, Jerry Falwell needs my help. I need to open my pocketbook and share my Social Security check. Now, circling back to co-belligerency, I said Francis Schaeffer devises this, sort of advances this idea that you can work with one another as long as you are oriented toward a godly aim, right? So in this little passage that I've clipped from meeting notes from a meeting of fundamentalists and evangelicals in response to the invitation issued by Jerry Falwell. This is what it's titled. The notes report 30% of moral majority are Roman Catholics. Mormons and Jews outnumber fundamentalists, but they work together even so, and this cooperation is based on their particular agreements as co-belligerents. And so as co-belligerents, right, you could set aside your doctrinal differences in order to achieve a common political aim. This is really important because it's what allows Protestants to enter into a coalition with Catholics, but it's also really important because it has remained the sort of theological through line of the coalition up to the present. Now that we have a new administration that is much more receptive to advancing Christian supremacism, there is a question around whether the doctrine of co-belligerency will continue to cohere the coalition, right? And what I mean by that is it's really easy to be co-belligerents when you don't have access to power and you're trying to get access to power. But once you have the power to implement what you want, if your co-belligerents have different visions, it's not entirely certain that they will continue to work together to advance those. All right, so we get to cross-denominational coalition building. Weyrich again says breaking the barriers between evangelical leaders and Catholics was key. There were years of anti-Catholic feeling in the fundamentalist community, but I had more in common with some in terms of belief in the Lord and fundamentals of the faith than I did with some liberal Catholics. I worked on Catholics to support evangelical candidates and evangelicals to support Catholic candidates. The other side of this is the communicative discourse and how it all gets translated to people. And it is through pro-family politics, which becomes the umbrella through which all of these different single issue organizations created by the new right and sort of local level organizations created by grassroots Protestants can forge a common political union. Now, Weyrich, seeing just so much of him in here. Well, first of all, from our point of view, this is really the most significant battle of the age-old conflict between good and evil, between the forces of God and forces against God that we've seen in our country. We see the anti-family movement as an attempt to prevent souls from reaching eternal salvation, and as such, we feel not just a political commitment to change the situation, but a moral and, if you will, a religious commitment to battle these forces. Similar language to Jerry Falwell's fundraising letter, right, about the sort of existential imminent threat posed to our survival. Finding number 3 is that together, conservative Catholics and Protestants advanced a proactive politics that was, and I would argue continues to be, dependent on 3 things. And I'm going to take these 3 things one by one, but I want to be mindful of time, so I'm going to try and do it quickly. The first is the construction of an imagined past. The second is the manufacturing of an identity of victimhood. And the third is the prefiguration of new social relations that are premised on the past and enacted in the present. So the first one, constructing the past. I, in the book, spent quite a bit of time problematizing the way in which we talk about backlash. And I want to be really clear, this sometimes has gotten me into hot water, that I don't suggest that backlash isn't a phenomenon, right? That people aren't sometimes motivated or mobilized in response to an action that occurs. Like I'm not pretending history doesn't exist. But the way in which we talk about backlash or the backlash narrative is what I try and problematize, because what that narrative does, what the sort of way in which we think of backlash does, is temporalize politics and allow for the manufacturing of a before and a future and a present moment. And in that sort of tripartite temporalization, what ends up happening is you idealize, you manufacture an imagined past in order to justify actions taken in the present to bring about a future, right? And all right, there are 3 kind of key backlash discourses that the Christian right likes to use. One concerns school prayer, One concerns contraception and abortion, and one concerns school desegregation. The way each of these narratives gets formulated is the Supreme Court and the society at large took these actions and in doing so destroyed the past, right? Things were really great when we had segregated schools. Now the court has done this radical thing of desegregating schools. And so we have to take action in order to try and get back to the past. Now, we see it a lot with the abortion narratives. Here's Francis Schaeffer again. He is responsible for the film Whatever Happened to the Human Race. But you can get the sense of this in the quote I have from Schaeffer and Coop's book, where they write, of all the subjects relating to the erosion of the sanctity of human life, abortion is the keystone. It is the first and crucial issue that has been overwhelming and changing attitude toward the value of life in general. The Supreme Court of the United States on January 22nd, 1873, in deciding Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton, declared that a new personal right or liberty existed in the Constitution, the right of a woman to procure an abortion at any time. The right of privacy was given a completely new interpretation, right? So this is the sort of backlash narrative around Roe. And as with other backlash narratives, it relies on a false argument that the past was somehow perfect, when the reality is that conservative Christians have always lamented the moment they are in at that moment, right? So we have, do I have this up? Yes. D.D. Herman writing, while some Christian right activists do idealize a mythical past, a cursory glance at their literature shows that they were never happy with the status quo and have no wish to return to it. For example, their vehemence against immorality was as strong in the 1950s as it is now, even though they idealize this earlier period. We see this over and over and over again. The reason why I think it's so important is that backlash helps to obscure and deflect. On the one hand, it can flatten history, masking ideological commitments and hiding institutional structures. On the other hand, it can be used to rhetorically shift the responsibility of right-wing activism onto the left, right? So it's the court's fault, or it is gay rights activists' fault that the Christian right needs to try and strip them of rights. In these ways, backlash functions as a script that constructs and reconstructs a particular historical narrative and related set of identities to shape our knowledge of both events and actors. This works to help cultivate and manufacture an identity of victimhood, which becomes central to the new Christian right. So conservative Protestant and Catholic elites cultivate this ideology by saying that it is really just defensive, right? That they are just motivated by a need to return to the past, that they are just defending themselves against the aggressive actions of their opponents. And if they do not act defensively, they will face an imminent and existential threat to their survival. Now, this leads to the third part of the argument I make, which is that they also embrace what I call prefigurative traditionalism. Prefigurative politics, I borrow the concept from Karl Barth, who's a Marxist theorist, and we associate it most with left-wing movements, right? Like Students for a Democratic Society or Occupy Wall Street, that you should embody the political practice that you seek to bring about, is the idea. I take this and say, well, prefigurative traditionalism seeks the embodiment of a set of social practices that are premised on traditional, quote unquote, hierarchies and social relations that more often than not have little relationship to history. Rather, the social relations enacted by and within Christian right communities reflect a political world that exists in the future. Prefiguration calls into being a new political world through the active construction of this mythologized past, and then seeks to create the conditions in which it can be produced in the future through social policy. So prefigurative policy is what the new Catholic New Right and the new Christian Right tried to put forward, but really with limited success in the 1980s. Where we are seeing the successes right now, right, as Project 2025 really builds on many of the policies initially proposed in the 1970s by especially Connie Marshner, but other Catholic New Right activists as well. So things like family policy, which includes reproductive health care, divorce law, and parenting programs. I would say 10 years ago, in polite society, you wouldn't hear people talking about reversing no-fault divorce or the 19th Amendment. And now people are pretty bold about talking, we want to get rid of no-fault divorce and maybe also women's right to vote. A social welfare policy, which includes welfare schemes to encourage two-parent traditional families. For the Catholic New Right in particular, this was one of the areas that they were most invested in, looking to reform the tax code, to provide subsidies to parents to have children, to veto universal child care in order to ensure that women would stay in the home rather than seek outside work. Where we see it now is with our current administration and the president terming himself the fertilization president, and proposing things like payments to women for having children. So big takeaway, the new Christian right was and is motivated not by a desire to conserve the past, but rather by a desire to create a new political order. Despite making rights-based claims, the new Christian right didn't look to conserve what existed, they looked to fundamentally transform it. And the way they sought to transform it, or the way they imagined transforming it, was in harnessing the coercive capacity of the state in order to impose these new policies that would produce the idealized vision of the past in the future. All right, I'll leave you with Paul Weyrich one last time. The old right considered itself a dying species. They tried to keep the flag flying while they saw the ship sink. In the new right, we trust in victory. We know that we represent the wave of the future. The old right had only one defensive strategy to retain the status quo. We don't accept the status quo. We want to change it. They did not carry the battle into the streets. We do.
Thank you very much. We'd like to take some questions. We have questions we can take from the audience here and from the Zoom audience. So if there isn't one, I'm prepared. Go ahead.
Well, yours are probably better than mine. Maybe you should go ahead with your question.
You can call.
Okay. Well, I have one thought, but one question. Well, J.D. Vance converted from where did he convert from? J.D. Vance.
He was a non-denominational Protestant.
He was just, and then the other thing that it just brings to mind the whole thing about reverie, the past. The past was not so great. They don't seem to bring that into the reality. The past was not great, and the reality of the past is not in the discourse. I think that's just.
Yeah, absolutely, and we see that. I recently was doing some new research with the Patriot Church, which is a very, very sort of hyper-nationalist Protestant congregation, and when I went to the church and sort of introduced myself to the pastor, the first thing one of the congregants said was, "We just need to repeal the 14th Amendment." And I was like, "Whoa, that's bold." And then the pastor spent a lot of time trying to explain, like, "Oh no, slavery was bad. We don't want slavery, but there are problems with the 14th Amendment." So there's a very delicate dance that happens when you want to venerate a period in time that should categorically be regarded as horrific. But yeah, super interesting.
Yeah.
Please.
At the beginning of your presentation of this, I found it exceptionally insightful. Thank you very much. You mentioned a global vision that they're working towards. Have you been able, have you been able in your research to be able to articulate, or have they articulated what this ultimate global vision that they're working for is?
Yeah, I love this question because it is hopefully what the second book, All Right, is going to be about. And I've sort of tentatively titled it Fever Dreams. And what I'm hoping to do is map out different visions of the future and what it is people are trying to accomplish. But from where I stand now, as I look at it, there are different and competing visions. Right? What conservative Catholics are imagining is very different than what Protestants affiliated with the New Apostolic Reformation are envisioning. I think on the conservative Catholic side, we see much more of an embrace of top-down authoritarian hierarchical structures. On the conservative Protestant side, there is still some nominal commitment to democratic decision making, but only for those who they believe are the remnant, right? Only for the chosen people. So it's very much like a Herrenvolk democracy. So there are different competing visions, but I do certainly, the far right has become increasingly global in its relations to other movements, right? There's, what is, Larry, you might need to help me out, nationalist, internationalist, there's a term that gets...
The Nationalist International.
Yeah, the Nationalist International, right? This is sort of, the far right is very, very much integrated in conversation with one another, but different visions of the future, I think, are going to rise to the forefront as they start to try and implement things. As I said, co-belligerency works when you're not in a position to actually create a theocracy. But if you have different visions, right, of like Herrenvolk democracy versus theocracy, it breaks down once you start to try and implement.
Please.
I have a question that kind of dovetails with what you were saying just now. I'm really curious at this moment how the dissonance between, the anti-Semitism of the right and, for instance, I had a friend in meeting with the Heritage Foundation, and they were explaining the Esther Project and had the mastermind George Soros in one of their slides.
Mm-hmm.
So like, this is a pitch to like an anti-Semitism funder. And how do they square? How are you seeing this coalition being built as we speak? And like, how are they squaring this sort of anti-Semitism with the fact that like the far right Jewish coalition right now is seeking power in American politics?
Yeah,
by Israel.
This is, I mean, it is such a complicated and messy set of relationships, right? But Christian Zionism, as I understand it, like I would label it anti-Semitic, right? Because Christian Zionism seeks the eventual destruction of Jews, right? That when the second coming occurs, Jews will suddenly realize that Jesus is the Messiah and convert, which is an eliminationist logic, right? It seeks the elimination of Jews. So I would argue that Christian Zionism is anti-Semitic at its core. And that's why we see in things like Project Esther, right? The sort of overt anti-Semitism being promoted in its, right? Project Esther, if folks aren't familiar, it's one of the playbooks produced by the Heritage Foundation for combating anti-Semitism. And it includes things like deploying the coercive power of the state against student protesters who are supportive of Palestine, which we are seeing now, right, be implemented. But it does so by first lambasting progressive Jews as bad Jews, right? And so it sort of opens with this quite anti-Semitic argument that like Heritage wouldn't have to be doing this work if Jews did it, but they're bad Jews, and so we need good Christians to save the Jews from themselves. I say this as a Jewish person, right? Like it is the first time I read Project 2025, I was like, okay, all right, I need to take a moment with this document. But I don't think that it's actually something that we can really reconcile, Kelly. Like it is messy and contradictory and instrumentalist politics, right? People who are seeking common aims, they're co-belligerents, they're working with each other, and they're not really thinking about what those long-term goals or aims will be if they are implemented.
Okay. From the Zoom audience, could you discuss Steve Bannon's contribution to the New Right Coalition, considering that he is Catholic and a fierce critic of the late Pope Francis?
Oh, I mean, so yes and no, right? Steve Bannon is part of this right-wing coalition that's, I would say, still forming, right? Like its contours are still really being mapped out and fleshed out. And it is, while I think the new right, sometimes I refer to it as my right, but that sounds wrong. But the new right of the 1970s is certainly alive and well within this coalition. But I wouldn't say that what is happening now is simply the sort of grown-up version of the new right of the 1970s, right? Other coalition partners have joined, other ideologies. There's a lot of sort of new elements to the right wing that weren't present in the 1970s. And part of this is just that Paul Weyrich, I don't think, ever dreamed of being able to do the things that the second Trump administration is doing. I think that was, right, there was still a sort of broad-based liberal consensus and commitment to democratic governance that Weyrich was operating within that no longer exists. So I think Bannon is part of pushing that frontier, right, of moving us out of the sort of liberal consensus and commitment to democratic norms. And I think Bannon is interesting because he is really the spokesperson for the pseudo-populism of this right-wing coalition, right? Talking about the need to support the working class and provide sort of populist economic policies and measures to support people while lambasting Pope Francis for being too progressive on economic and social issues. So I think Bannon is a complicated figure. that's my dodge on answering that.
I wonder if you would agree that on the level of law and theory, that Catholic thinkers have been far more significant than Protestant thinkers with respect to this coalition. And in that respect, could you comment on the place of Opus Dei via Leonard Leo and the creation of, for example, the current Supreme Court?
Yes, absolutely. So if we sort of drill down into the theology, right, we can find that distinction between Protestant and Catholic support for intellectual traditions and institutions really grounded in their different interpretations of Christianity, right? American Protestant denominations are very much focused on an individual relationship with Christ, and often are often sort of dovetail into an anti-authoritarian, anti-authority, anti-institution ethos, right? Sort of skeptical of the church or any sort of mediating institutions. It should be a personal, immediate relationship. And we don't need scholars or other people to interpret our faith or really anything for us, right? Gives you the hyper-individualistic, anti-institutionalist vibe. On the conservative Catholic side, or on the Catholic side, you have a much longer tradition of venerating authority in institutions and of respecting hierarchy, right? And of expecting information to be mediated through those institutions and intellectuals within them, whether they are faith leaders or whether they are scholars. So I think that's where you, right, like you really see the divide occur very early on. And then that gives rise to much more support within the Catholic tradition for scholarly enterprise, and in particular for juridical thought, right? Catholic natural law is rooted in the theology and becomes such a core component of the way in which many jurists think about the law, and increasingly the US Constitution. Adrian Vermeule is, I think, the best example I can give of someone who has
Robert George.
Oh yeah, okay, Robert George. No. Well, but Robert George is so much like more reasonable compared to Adrian Vermeule. Vermeule is out there being like, we want a monarchy. Robert George is, I think, still grounded in some of these democratic norms. But Leonard Leo, right, is the person who really has taken it upon himself to help sort of the Federalist Society and a host of other organizations. I think he has his hands in many different pots relating to the law to train up lawyers with a very particular worldview and interpretation of the law, and then to lobby to position them in places of power. So now we have a Supreme Court that is 5 or 6 Catholics, depending on how you count. And that is quite striking, right? Given the percentage of Catholics in the United States, like it is not proportional to the number of Catholics in the United States, but Catholics have a much longer tradition, I think, of seeking out the law and engaging with it, and then have been aided by conservative activists like Leonard Leo.
Also from the Zoom audience, I'm curious about how or if you see the Christian Right Coalition shaping ongoing debates about pronatalism. Any comments on new coalition with secular gaps?
Groups.
Pardon me?
Secular groups.
Thank you. Secular groups. I.e. pronatalism, for example, tech/Musk.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to be a fly on the wall at one of the pronatalist conferences that are happening. There's been a lot of attention given to them by the New York Times recently, and I think that
Bigger families.
Bigger families. I'm gonna come into the question from the side. So one of the places that I think you can most clearly see the influence of Catholicism on our reproductive politics is in the debate over IVF, right? And was it last year in Alabama? Now I'm going to get my facts wrong, but I think it was Alabama, right? That a judge ruled that IVF was homicide. And it set off this kind of national outcry and a lot of concern. The very argument that you could ever say a fertilized embryo was a human comes to us from Catholic traditions and Catholic understandings of the seamless fabric of life and when life begins, that have been picked up by Protestants, but that really present a point of conflict because the pronatalists are also often in support of IVF, right? So you have, again, to the question around anti-Semitism, right? You have these coalitions forming, you have these groups that are kind of working together, but in ways that are contradictory and really messy. So Catholics who are pronatalists, Protestants who are pronatalists, tech oligarchs who are pronatalists, they have a common end: larger families, more arguably more white children, which is almost always the subtext of pronatalist arguments, but how they understand their own relationship to reproduction, to the body, to these like big $1 million questions about when life begins, right, changes. So I think it's messy and contradictory.
And your question?
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation. Something that I found really interesting is in your book is how you showed that the pro-family politics is also articulated with a vision of the state, and they're also asking for specific economic policies. And I don't see that very often combined together and studied together in scholars on the right. I feel like there's a division between moral politics, like studies around abortion and anti-gay rights movements and things like that, and then on the other side, economic conservatism. And so, do you think it's something that scholars should be more careful about, to study both those aspects of conservatism together? If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I 1000% think that we should be always looking at both of these things, right? We should always be, as Ronnie Lipschitz, who was one of my professors at UCSC, would tell me, always follow the money, right? Like no matter what, follow the money. So I think absolutely that should be the case. What I would take as my model for the best scholarship that does this is Melinda Cooper's book on family values. I think she does just the most brilliant job of looking at the intersection of the two. So I'd highly recommend it.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering about, as you were talking about the Protestant groups that were more bottom up, in terms of the coalition with the Catholic groups that were more elite projects, if I understood correctly. And I was just wondering that how did kind of the coalition and engagement of family politics kind of come about? Because I was wondering in terms of the Protestant groups, and you mentioned populism once, and also worker salaries, protecting the family, yourself having social security. Like, I was just wondering if you could kind of detangle all of that.
I can try. So I don't classify the new right of the 1970s as populist. I always will say they were pseudo-populist. They made overtures to populism in order to try and bring voters into their coalition. But what I see them doing is using economic policies as sort of a coercive tool, right? And so, and populists can do this as well, but I don't think that they are. I just don't think that they are populist. I think instead they are looking to harness the capacity of the state in particular ways. And when populist rhetoric serves that, they use it. In terms of the bottom up and the top down, so my focus is very much on elites in both groups, because that's where my attention was. But there's some, in the book, I go a little bit into some of the grassroots groups, particularly those who oppose secular humanism in education and sex education curriculums, right? The sort of grassroots mobilization. The reason I glossed over it is because it's a much longer, complicated story. So Jerry Falwell always claimed that Roe versus Wade was what made him decide to get into politics. But he doesn't really launch into committed political campaigning or sort of grandstanding until somewhere between 3 and 5 years after Roe versus Wade. But Jerry Falwell had this problem, which is that he had delivered a very, very controversial sermon lambasting Martin Luther King Jr. for leading people in public protest. And Falwell had said, ministers have no place in the streets. Ministers should not do politics. And so he had to come up with some way of justifying his change of heart, right? Because he opposed ministers being politically engaged when it had to do with civil rights for African Americans. But when it had to do with opposing the desegregation of all white Christian schools, he was all in on political activism. So he had to come up with some way of bridging that divide. And I argue, right, that he sort of looked to the grassroots, and the grassroots were already doing that work around opposition to abortion in schools. And so he glommed onto that as the way in which he could justify his activism.
I have from Zoom a question you perhaps get frequently. Based on your research, do you have any insights into how opponents of this coalition can best work to stop them?
I think we have a playbook, right? So the new right claimed that it learned from the left, right? Paul Weyrich loved to say that he got his idea for building institutions and fundraising because he was maybe inadvertently invited to a meeting in Capitol Hill of civil rights leaders. And he was like, oh, I just watched them and I copied what they did. Not entirely true, but it does provide an opening for me to say that he very well may have been borrowing the strategy of prefigurative politics from the left, right? Because he claimed that he was learning his strategies from the left. I would say that the left now could take a look at the playbook that the new right created, and it begins with local elections and primarying people who are members of the party you support, who are not, for the new right, it was who were not conservative enough, right? For the progressives, it would be primarying establishment Democrats who are not progressive enough. But there's also this problem that progressives and liberals have, which is that we do not fund political activism in the same way that the right does. The right pours its money into think tanks and into electoral politics. The left divides up its money between museums and NPR and PBS and, you know, art programs, a million different issues that are important, but that then lead us to not have institutions, think tanks, or political action campaigns that can do the work that is being done on the right. This is a little shout out for the Center for Right Wing Studies and a reminder that you should donate money to them because we do need to actually fund organizations that support critical work in this arena.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Just 1 second. Apropos of what you said about copying the left, on the right, people are frequently using the phrase, we are the new Gramscians.
We're a nuclear option?
No, Gramsci, who was,
I know Gramsci.
yeah, on the right, they now say that they are the new Gramscians.
Oh, they are the new Gramsci.
Yeah.
Yeah, that, I mean, feels a little bit like a dagger to the heart, but I've heard that before.
Actually, when the post-fascist party collapsed and turned into other things in Italy, they announced that their traditions, they had 3 identities, and one of them was Gramsci, which drove the Italian left nuts.
Nuts, yes.
Okay. Did James Dobson's focus on the family organization play any role in creating, I think, the Protestant Catholic coalition?
That's a great question. I think focus on the family comes a little bit later than the sort of point of coalition building that I'm examining. But certainly Dobson has been influential in helping to continue the work that was done. So,
what about the Powell memo? What about the Powell memo? Does that have any relationship to what you were discussing?
Not that I have come across.
No. Okay. Right.
Could I just ask you to comment on both the right and the left, Banyan and on the left, the Workers' Family Party, are doing outreach to working people. Is there some intersection between how their outreach is and how they define what they're going to do for the working person? I mean, because they're both now reaching out to working people to try and say, well, we are the party of the working people. The left is doing that, and the right is doing it now. So I was wondering if there's some intersection there, or it's just like they totally offer different things to conservative working people and liberal working people, or if there's just some intersection of how they're defining, or because they use that term the working people, we're the party, you should come with us. But
I think that might be a little outside my scope, just because that's right. Like I'm such a hedgehog, and I'm really focused on the right, and so I don't know how well I can speak to what like Working Families Party is doing. But I think that my sort of general response would be who gets included in the definition of working people is different for the sort of Bannon nationalists and or progressives affiliated with the Working Families Party, right? Like they're defining who the working people are in very different ways that are often racialized and attached to immigration status. So that's my
that's a good one.
From the Zoom audience, which old right was Wyrick referring to in your closing quote? To suggest William Buckley and company, segregationists, searchers.
I think for Wyrick, you would say all of the above, right? It was all the old right, and he was the new right. But I think that there's a really interesting set of questions about how we should periodize the right, and the way in which we maybe artificially want to define moments of the right, as I do with the new right? They were very intent on self-definition and limiting their movement to that period in time. But I think we should be skeptical of that, right? Because there are continuities and ruptures among and between these different rights. Some Bircher stuff crops up in the archives of the new right. You know, they're certainly still very much part of the sort of general milieu that the new right was operating in. So was what Wyrick saying that they're the old right? I mean, like I said, anyone that wasn't him was the old right, but I don't think that's accurate or fair.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, just to go back quickly to the point you were making about the left writ large in their funding of things much more distributed compared to the right. Is that observation could be extended to the philanthropic sector, right-wing foundations versus non-right-wing in terms of their funding strategies?
I think so. I'm really, and my knowledge of this really comes from conversations with Kelly Jones, who's in the room, and Alex DeBranco, who both have done work sort of looking at the way in which funding happens. But I would say it does extend to philanthropic, but I'll defer to Kelly.
Oh, thanks. I don't have much to say, but I from a fundraising point of view on the left for a public institution, they certainly have a more robust guaranteed funding base for these types of institutional, or find more important, like the more ideas based and value based conditioning of professors and bringing them up through ranks. We're still the lack of funding on the left with regards to these things makes it hard to create these pipelines, unfortunately.
Yeah, and also extends to the courts, right? You look at what's happened with the courts, and the right had a much more developed long-term strategy for transforming the courts. And at the sort of state legislative level, right, the right, I mean, this is something that I sort of feel like the Democrats were just asleep at the wheel, as the right very successfully put in place really strong state level party institutions, and then gerrymandered districts, and created a sort of system by which they could maintain power. So I think across multiple different levels, the right has more successfully funded and executed its agenda.
I think with that, please join me in thanking.
Such a depressing note we're in.
All right, hold on.
No, we can end there.
Wait a second. You began with the 1920s and the antipathy toward Catholicism. When I was a kid in Brooklyn, New York, there was a joke, and it was about the presidential campaign of Al Smith in 1928. He was the first Catholic to run for president. And what was the telegram that Al Smith sent to the Pope after he lost?
I know this, and I'm blanking.
I can tell you.
Tell me.
Unpack.
Unpack.
Perhaps a better note to end on.
There we go. We'll end on that one.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.